Yeah, I mean, what is freedom but the ability to choose? And it's a scary thing to make a decision because there are repercussions to decisions. So it's, if you don't have a framework for what might be a good decision and what might be a bad decision, if you aren't comfortable with ambiguity, someone, stepping in and saying, hey, I'm presenting any decision, as opposed to ambiguity, it can be very attractive to just choose going forward with that decision as opposed to lurking in your own ambiguity or going through the effort that's required to create your own framework for making a better decision.
I'm Miriam Hoffman, a full-time college student living in Carbondale, Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today we have an in-person interview with my man, executive producer Ben Anderson. Many longtime listeners of the podcast know that Ben actually helped me transition once coronavirus hit into doing this podcast with people all over the world. Ben is an entrepreneur. He runs a website called Wand where he connects people that want their houses cleaned with housekeepers, and he also has worked with the Articulate Ventures company to start a boutique PR firm where we work with specialty clients that want to figure out how can they get their name out into the world without spending money on buying ads, but actually get their message out in creative, unique, authentic ways. I love working with Ben. He's over at the office working several times a week. We work out together. I spend all kinds of time with him. So this is a very fun interview. We are going to bounce all over the place. This is definitely a podcast where if you've never listened to it, this is going to give you a chance to see the breadth of topics. We talk about everything from the advent of the pride flag becoming really prominent right now in society on to things like what's going on with our culture. How long will the nation state be the predominant way that people organize their the way they interact with one another? And then we get into talking about various podcast guests that we've had on, what they've brought up, what they've taught us, and what we've enjoyed about it. This is a fantastic interview, and I'm really glad you're here. So I hope you will stick around for this fantastic interview. Before we go there, I'm always talking about the Articulate Ventures Network. This is a place where people that are listeners of the podcast can gather to be able to talk with other people that like conversations like the ones we have here. Inside of this network, there is a news feed where people are able to ask questions, bring up subjects that you're not really able to talk about in regular life because our society just doesn't let you have open conversations anymore. We hold a book club, we have a movie night, and it's really a great place to have a digital neighborhood where you can meet intelligent people that are listening to some of the same things that you are, but also bring a whole host of new ideas. It is a phenomenal place. We love it. I cherish it. And I spend a whole lot of time working with the people in there to continue to make that digital community a place where we can learn, grow, and become something better than we are right now. So if you're interested in joining, know that I am talking directly to you and inviting you to join us at this wonderful place. If you're interested, go to network.articulate.ventures to find out more. Also, before the interview, I have had a big upswing in people reaching out for legacy interviews. This is where I am invited to talk with somebody that's a loved one of yours and ask them questions about who they are, what they believe, what their memories are, what their values are. And we put it into a recording that you're able to download and access anytime you want. People have had me interview their children as they're young people trying to capture that moment of innocence. And I've spoken with people that are nearing the end of their life, trying to capture what is going on with the values that they have and what do they hope lives on. It has been across the gamut. And I was just telling my wife last night that this is perhaps the most valuable work I've ever put into the world. You can see how much people love and cherish these recordings. And now, having had some of my guests actually pass away, I've had people refer to those interviews as the most precious and valuable things in their lives. So if you are interested, you can definitely, we can do it online. We can do it over a Zoom call if your loved one is somewhere far away, or we can do it even in person at the Articulate Ventures studios. So you can find out more by going to store.articulate.ventures and see if this is the right type of legacy interview for you. A lot of people do them as presents, and we can always work out the scheduling. So I hope you'll enjoy it. All right. Now, without further ado, we're going to head to an interview with my man, Mr. Ben Anderson. Welcome back to the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So, everybody that listens to the podcast regularly knows you and I see each other all the time. We work together very closely. So these are always interesting discussions because we talk about so much. But one of the things that you and I talked about recently was this huge proliferation of the pride flags all over everything. We've seen it at bookstores. We've seen it plastered on all the logos of various businesses, everything from Bear Crop Sciences all the way out to, grocery stores. And even yesterday, I saw somebody on social media with the police cars covered in a pride flag. What are your kind of general thoughts on what this is all about? Why is there such an explosion of this going on right now?
Yeah, we're going right for the jugular. My default is that what doesn't affect me doesn't bother me until it does, and that might sound like a backward statement, but it's one of those things where it's like yesterday, right? Walking down, Euclid, and you go by the bookstore, and they're kind of promoting it's Pride Month, right? So here's all of our content centered around these sorts of ideas, right? And it's one thing to have you got your adult books there, and then you go and here's the window with the children's section, and you start to see like the all the thoughts that all the times that I knew that I was gay growing up, sort of thing, and the Prince and the Knight sort of. And I'm not not to call out any specific deals, but it was just it's one of those things where you see that and you're like, that's weird. This is the content that we're promoting to people that maybe they're under age of 10, 9, 8, whatever, right? And for not that they're bad ideas, it seems like a weird thing to me. That's where it starts to cross that line of doesn't affect me, doesn't bother to me. Okay, this is weird. And to like what you just said, right, with the police cars, it's like why would we put something that is very clearly now, right, a political statement on law enforcement vehicles, what's supposed to be kind of an unbiased, like law keeping entity that seems like it's edging closer towards that edge of chaos there. It seems like a weird deal.
Yeah, to me, that was the one that really made me like stop and say, wait a second, like this actually, people saying, oh, it's no big deal that these corporations do it. They're just doing it because their customers want it, or, this is a good way to be supportive of their employees. That may all be true. But when you start adding it on to police cars, being wrapped in this, and I just saw it on a random TikTok, who knows what that really was. But it does seem like, what is the meaning of this symbol? Because it means something, right? It doesn't mean nothing. And if it means something, what does it mean? And what are people agreeing to or espousing or putting forward? And that's the thing that makes me a little bit tense about this, because I personally, several years ago, was working for Monsanto. And when I brought Jordan Peterson to the American Farm Bureau, the people that were the most angry were from the LGBTQ plus group within the company, saying, hey, Monsanto, you agreed that you wouldn't do things like this. And they were like, no, we didn't. And they're like, yes, you did. Look, you're, saying we believe in pride. These are the things that we mean. And so the company itself is saying, this is not necessarily, we didn't say we would or wouldn't talk to anybody. But then on the flip side of it, the people that are saying, hey, we're a part of this group, this is what this means to us. So it's not a cost-free thing, which is what I see a lot of people saying, like, hey, it doesn't get in my way. I don't want to tell people what to say. But then you get into a position where people start saying, well, you did use that and it does mean something, and we think it means this. And I think it's far more playing with fire than people realize, because symbols mean things. That's why people put those symbols out there. And I think it's a weird quirk in our society that's going on right now for people to either be like, my default position is just to wave the flag along with everybody else, or just to let other people, do what they want to do, and I'm not going to interfere. Because I think you wake up one day and you realize, like, whoa, we didn't agree to those things that you're saying that we did agree to.
Yeah, I mean, that's where my head goes, I guess, as you're starting to say that, right? There's like the overlap of what these symbols represent. And if you're gonna subscribe to putting something, and as the culture of a symbol evolves, that's another thing where you can go back in hindsight and say, oh, well, you flew this once and now we represent X. Now you have to represent X, or you're not with us anymore. And what does it mean for you to not be with us anymore? And who is us? Like you made a great point of sometimes these don't even lap in with the actual customer bases of the companies in terms of like the values that might be more broadly held by the actual buying groups. So then it really comes down to who are you trying to benefit? Because like my mind goes to this is a marketing tactic at the end of the day. If you're a company, your number one priority is to net revenue back for shareholders, right? So if your goal is to net revenue back for shareholders, whatever the scenario is, it's like you're making decisions that influence this one value proposition. So that's the broad conception is, and this goes to your PR idea as well, right? Of what is the fashion layer of culture right now? What is the broader buying group buying into? It's these ideas, and it's a strange deal.
Yeah, it was in a discussion where like the vast majority of the people in the discussion basically said, hey, I think David Brooks wrote an article from the New York Times. He said, look, when corporations do this, they water down the idea. And everybody was kind of like, yeah, I think the more that corporations do this, the less the symbol means. So it's really not even fair to the group that's putting it forward. And I actually think the exact opposite. I think that the more that this gets put forward as something that corporations must do, otherwise they're exposing themselves to some sort of reputational risk because they didn't, only reinforces the fact that this is a political symbol, and it is not just a symbol, but a funnel, right? It's a funnel that says, not only should you put this flag up because if you don't, you're somehow, mistreating people, or you're not giving them the respect that they're owed, but then also, once you've started down that path, like you had said, the symbol evolves. And like, you don't really know where this is going. And oftentimes the people in front of political movements have intentions that are far more aggressive or far more deeper believers about what this thing could mean. And I just think, like, if you're going to put forward that corporations are actually people, and you're going to say, we're going to allow corporations to spend money as though they're individuals, and we're going to say that, like, the way that this corporation works is that it's a conglomeration of people and we're representing them, I'm certain that there are a lot of people in these corporations that they maybe aren't against anything to do with homosexuality or anything to do with whatever Pride has going on, but yet they don't want to be a part of that symbol. And if they voice that opinion, what would happen to them inside of that corporation?
Yeah, I guess that's a scenario where it might be actively more polarizing, right? And, then you can steel man the other side of the argument, right? Which is like, well, you should be able to accept these sorts of ideas. But then that's where it's, I think it's strange how there's a need to put these things forward, whether it's, and, that goes for, pride, like environmentalism sort of, Black Lives Matter sort of stuff. And I'm theoretically for the root goal of all of these movements at like the highest level, right? All of these things are things that we should be aware of and working on socially to improve the net scenarios of the people involved in these groups. But at the same time, I guess what's the goal of what to accomplish with putting these things forward in a way where, I don't know. It's
to me, I would even question the thing that you default to, which is the one that like feels natural. Like, look, I don't have a problem with any of these groups, but I kind of don't like what's going on, right? The default position should be, hey, I'm allowed to believe whatever I want to believe, just like you're allowed to believe whatever you want to believe. And when you start asserting it by like when people drive into their office and they see that here's the American flag, and then right underneath it is a flag of a political persuasion, whether it's Pride or any other one, right? An environmental flag. Now all of a sudden people are having to say, the place that I work holds a political position that I myself do not. So, am I doing the right thing by just being quiet and saying, well, that's their belief and not mine, and there are other things they believe in that I also don't believe in, so that's okay? Or are you then morally obligated to saying, like, wait a second, I'm a part of this. Everyone knows that my family derives our income from it, the way that my life is structured, and I don't want that political thing being ascribed to me and what I believe and who I am. So either I need to stand up and push back, which might have ramifications inside of the company, or I need to leave and go find another job. It is inherently polarizing. To me, choosing those symbols is something that's saying, like, all right, the corporation, whether that's the PR people inside of the corporation or actually the leadership, are making decisions, and we kind of have this default position that everyone will just kind of go along with it. And I don't think that's healthy.
Well, and this is the weird thing, right? Is the people that you're like hypothesizing here of being against something when these sorts of symbols come up in their place of work or whether it's in their community, whatever, right? What do you think they're against? Because I can't answer that question, but I'm thinking to myself how it seems like we're on a riff here where we're theoretically, against these symbols, but like I just said, I'm not against what they represent. I'm very for the, the integration of everybody believing whatever the hell it is you want to believe, doing whatever the hell it is you want to do, right? But not having to put that forth in a way in society and in culture where it's like, this is what I do, 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 where it's like, I don't know, there's that weird balance there of I want everybody to be able to do what they want to do. I want everybody to be accepted no matter what they do within reason, as long as it falls within certain moral guidelines. But it's like, well, what do you think? What do you think those people are pushing back against if it's not the ideas represented by these symbols?
Well, and like to your point, where the line gets drawn, right? Like when you start, so for me, the pride thing, let's imagine a scenario in which there was some sort of like heterosexual pride, right? Or something like that. I don't want anything about sexuality talked about at work, because I don't care at all what other people are doing at home and with whom and what it is, like their activities. I don't care. Straight, gay, anywhere in between. I don't want to know. And in fact, the idea, like we have this like weird, almost ironic part of culture that says we should have work-life balance. You shouldn't have to work all the time. You shouldn't have to, have your work flood into every aspect of your personal life. You should have time with your family, time away from your boss controlling what you're doing. Why in the world would we have this concept of bring your whole self to work, and also that we should talk about things like sexuality in the workplace? Now, I have a good friend that said, like, look, I worked for several years where every time I was in communications with my friends over in the Balkans or in the Middle East, I had to pretend as though my partner was my friend or my roommate, and I didn't like that. That sucks. I don't want that. But at the same time, is the correct answer then to assert that sexuality is overtly something that we should talk about at work, or something that your employer should care at all about?
Well, and then maybe this is the thing, is that the goal of putting these sorts of symbols forward so prevalently, right, is to push the Overton window open so that you can edge, because that's where it's like there's the cost benefit analysis, right? It's like these scenarios happen where you have to go and you have to lie about who you are in certain settings. And that's exactly what I'm saying. Like, I don't want anybody to have to do that under any circumstances, within reason. If you're a psychopath, like, lie about yourself in public, right? But so if the goal is to push open that window to ease a broader group of people in this general direction of being more accepting of these ideas, but then it's you can, I don't know, it's weird, because I can see where there's the opportunity for benefit there if you're looking at it from that perspective, but then on the flip side, it's like I don't know, then you're bringing what you're talking about, ideas of sexuality and stuff, into the workplace and creating the potential for further division just by I don't know, people taking it the wrong way.
It's a funny thing, the way that corporations now are kind of being pushed into the, like, silence is violence, or you're not allowed to not take a position. So was it Base Camp came out and said, like, look, we want you to not bring your whole self to work. We want you to just bring your work self to work, and we're not going to talk about political things. And then there were groups of people that, popped up to be like, oh, look how awful this is. They're saying you shouldn't be allowed to be political. Well, what if I want to express that? Like, why are you blocking that from me? And I mean, I think that is the example of the Overton window being kicked wide open. And maybe there was a time when only conservative views were allowed to be accepted in a company, and this is just the pushback that goes the other direction, where now, hey, we want not just conservative, we want liberal, and now everybody's feeling like, well, my views should be heard, and now it's just a cacophony of political views, of which, unless your job has directly related to the politics of every day, I don't see the benefit to anyone, employees, customers, shareholders, board, why you would bring these issues in as a fundamental part of who you are and what you're spending your limited bandwidth talking about with your employees.
Right. And I guess that's what I was getting at, right? Unless the goal is to push that Overton window open, then maybe for people like describing the Overton window, it's this concept, right, of swinging the pendulum so far in one direction so that the mean of, what the society behavior might be moves closer in one direction. So if the goal here is to swing so far in this direction that we pull a broader acceptance of these ideas in that direction, that's where I see like a net potential for good, right? So if that's the goal there, then that's great, right? If it brings us closer to that direction, but then there's that deal, right, where you're bringing you're bringing sexuality and stuff into the workplace, and then you have to contend with having these sorts of conversations in work, and it's the conflict of interest of I'm here to work, and now we have these sorts of things here, and how can you not have discussions come up around X or Y or Z when you're here to get a job done? I don't know. It's a marketing tactic.
I'm super open to the idea that I live in the world where, I fit straight within the median, right? Like I am, heterosexual, right in my late 30s. I have a child, I'm married. And so for me, anything outside of that, it's like, why don't we just stick with what I know and what I like? I'm totally comfortable with somebody coming around and being like, hey, this is something you didn't consider. I remember probably over a year ago, I had Peggy Guest on. And she talked about the movements of feminism and things that needed to change about society, that really, because I had been living in a world that had been changed by those very feminists, I kind of wrote it off or didn't think it was that big of a deal. And now that I'm like a parent, for example, and I see how hard it is for me to both do work and be a good parent. And if that was always solely on the woman and that was just the way that it was and the men were allowed to be at work, that it is good that somebody kicked open that door, and I am certain that it was uncomfortable when they were doing it, that people were like, hey, why don't we just keep the order the same way that it was? Why are you messing around with it? So I'm open to the idea that my perspective on this is lacking in some serious way. But I think that it's far better to move slow in adopting new things or new positions and make sure you don't break the stability of things than it is to let's just accept it, let's bring it in, and then we'll decide what does this mean to all of us afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, things are generally slow and then they're all at once, and we've been living in the age of acceleration here now for nearly 2 or 3 decades since the inception of the internet. And we've had this conversation offline, right, of this idea of I've got an uncle who's gay, right? And I didn't live in the 90s. I was born in 98, right? But I hear I associate with a lot of adults, there's an age gap between us, other people kind of in our social circle. I hear my dad, other relatives talk of there's this conception of, oh man, the 90s, it was everybody was so united, there were no conversations circulating around these sorts of things. It was just you like to do X, or you like same sex, whatever it might be, or color your skin, who cares, who gives a shit? We all work together, we all interact together in society. And it was I don't know. I would really not blame it on, but it's an after effect of the inception of the internet, where it's okay, we're all able to talk about things and have really, really unfortunate, but rare negative scenarios kind of rise up because what polarizes people to react to something, either extreme excitement that might be positive and joy, or it's extreme aversion to something, or sadness or disgust, whatever it might be. So more often than not, there's these ideas of like, oh man, the puppies on the internet, whatever will follow, and like these sorts of things. That's great. But then, flipping the side of the coin to like the police violence issue and kind of the, like flying the flags of, BLM is like an alternative. It's like the abstraction of the conversation we're having right now is this same concept of, putting forth symbols hyper prominently to represent like an idea. I think a lot of the things, it's like, okay, these are good ideas at their core, but why are they so prevalent now, based off of issues that do happen, shitty issues that do happen, but
you've brought up this like 90s concept that like that was when things were good, and I flatly reject this idea. I think that it is like the 20-year nostalgia that happens, that like 20 years ago I would have been, in my early 20s, maybe like 18, 17, maybe if you even go a little bit further back than that. And I think that the reason that it feels like things were better then is, one, you cut out all of the tension. Like it's really difficult for you to remember day in and day out what you were anxious about that was in the news. And then the things that do come to mind, like, a lot of them are not like, you don't feel that same sense of like, oh shit, things are changing faster than my brain can accept them, because they've already accepted. So you look back and you're like, oh, that's just the way that it was. But I look back into the 90s and I think, Billy Joel wrote that song, We Didn't Start the Fire. And like you listen to the words of that song. And to me, that was like, that is an artifact that we should always hold, because he was saying, look at all these things that look like they're crazy on fire and it wasn't our fault. And these things just happened to us. And I think you could take that song, that same beat, the same excitement, the same passion that he had, and put it into a song today and say like, look, the fire was started way before us, right? And I think that it's like I think that nostalgia is a dangerous idea. I mean, Rodney King was in the 90s, right? So like there was definitely police brutality. Then there were riots, and like people were standing on top of shops shooting at other people. So for me, we tend to have this sensation that things were better or easier. But I think there was a lot of cultural change going on. Like this would have been the time, I don't even know if you remember the show The Real World. So there was a show on MTV called The Real World that where they would bring all these people together and have them live in a house. And it was the first, now you see these shows all the time, like reality TV, but these were the first ones. So there was one where there was a gay man named Pedro that had AIDS. And it was the first time I was a kid from Eureka, Illinois. I was probably like, 10 or 11 years old. I didn't know any gay men that had AIDS. And yet now we're watching a television show where you're seeing him not be a threat to anybody in the house. They can live next to him. They can eat off the same silverware. They can, share bathrooms, and they're not afraid. And what that did for society, moving the Overton window further open. And I remember there was always this like country guy who wore a cowboy hat, and he was from like, somewhere in Nashville or something. He was trying to be a music singer, and the dynamics between those two was watched by everybody in the world. And then when Pedro died, I remember Bill Clinton coming on and saying, none of us can ever say anymore that we didn't have a gay friend. We did. He's right here, Pedro. And so now, like, look what this has done for society. And so I definitely understand that culture has to change. And maybe the pride flags are a movement of that. But I think there's something else going on here. When Pedro and The Real World were happening, nobody was being asked to sit underneath the banner of an ideology. They just were able to observe it and say, well, what does this mean for me? What does this change for what I think, as opposed to, am I being forced to represent an idea that I don't necessarily have any connection with?
Right. Yeah. That's the thing, is like the not having a connection. It's not like you oppose. It's weird because it's not like you have a direct opposition to the idea, because I don't think either of us have a direct opposition to because what's the root idea there? It's to be more accepting of people with a certain sexual preference in society. That's great. We've got mutual friends who have these sorts of like preferences. That's this should be the case. But when it becomes so prevalent that you are forced to either be really for it or like like, okay, that's okay, like I got my friends over here who have these preferences, and like we'll hang out, whatever, but I don't want to go take part in the parade or, have to wear the t-shirts to company on whatever. I don't know. It's just a strange thing. And to the 90s thing also, I mean, I don't like, I didn't grow up there, so I have no, I have no tether to this idea as a concept. It's like an observation of like, oh man, like things were just better, right? It's like this perception though. Like my cousin got me a really good book for Christmas last year, Factfulness. I think the author.
Hans Rollings.
Yeah, I didn't remember his name. Thank you. But this book was phenomenal in that it outlines all of the ways over decades and centuries that we've made, in many ways exponential progress in terms of poverty and the ability to feed the world and quality of life. And it included issues like race and these sorts of things, and broader acceptance of different social norms. And from a fact-based, like data-based perspective, which is like always where like a mind like mine goes, I'm like always like, okay, what does the data say? Whether it's issues like this or, like virus, whatever, right? Like that's what I'm going to be looking at. We're getting better across the board. Generally speaking. So it's this weird dichotomy of like the perception changing, and to your point of like slow progress being better. I don't know if that's always the case that slow progress is better, especially when we live in this, like, again, like the age of acceleration where it's like we've grown accustomed to having our needs met instantaneously. So maybe this is a contributing factor to, oh my gosh, I want to see social change and I want to see it right now, like yesterday sort of thing, as opposed to like, okay, we're making progress. Yeah, it's a strange deal. I'm not wrapping back around to a point, but some reverb.
Well, so it's a funny thing to think about. What is it that we're observing right now? And I always talk about, the media doesn't tell us what to think. They tell us what to think about. And if I didn't see these things on social media, I wouldn't actually see them, because in my, what Lyle Benjamin refers to as his porch view, if I walk out on my porch, I don't see any of these issues. So I also have to accept the fact that any sort of frustration or like tension that I feel about, look at all this change and they're forcing it on us, and like maybe I don't want to be under this banner or that banner. At the end of the day, you do have to say like, well, maybe the reason that I'm stressed about that is I'm exposing myself to things that are purposefully trying to grab my attention with the most ratcheted up thing that they can, as opposed to saying, why don't I go to an art museum and try and observe where the light is coming in from the side of the frame? Like, if that's all you did was go to an art museum and say, where is the light coming from in this artist's perspective? You couldn't then also be consumed by these ideas that the news or the media is trying to grab your attention with.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thing, right? In terms of like why it maybe default to this camp of like, it doesn't bother me a whole lot until it does. Like it crosses a point where it's like, oh, I'm walking down the street and that's kind of weird. And I begin to create like a theory of mind for how this is like, what the effects of these sorts of things are, in terms of like, pushing an idea forward, especially further down the age bracket where it's like, you're freaking 10 years old. It's like, if you're a boy, maybe you think you're a girl when you're playing at recess. And when you're a girl, maybe you think you're a boy when you're playing at recess. And it's like, then 10 years go by and like, I don't know, different things settle in. But,
yeah, I mean, and I like with children. So now that I have a small child, for me, any of the ideas about the news, let's move beyond just what we were talking about with the banners and flags. Like, I want my child's childhood to be that Garden of Eden. I want her to learn all the names of the animals and be able to name all of the plants and be able to understand smells and colors and all of the things that are required, well, not required, that allow you to embrace the fullness of whatever your humanity is prior to accepting in any of the chaos that's going on with the news. So the Yosha idea that the Garden of Eden is actually childhood, and the parent's responsibility is to try and keep those walls up, not for as long as you can, but for long enough for the child to develop into whoever it is that they're going to be before society starts to tell them this is what you should pay attention to.
Yeah. That makes sense, because it's like it's stealing your attention away. In a way, like the news and a number of different things, especially right now, right? Yeah.
What is capturing your attention in the news right now? What have you been paying attention to?
I'm keeping my eyes on like how the economy is behaving over the last couple of days, especially, right?
Man, Lacey Hunt seems like he's just killing it right now. So, we had the economist Lacey Hunt on, and he talked about how, we're in short-term inflation, but eventually the cure for high prices is high prices, because then people will flood in to fill the market. And just the other day, I saw that lumber has come down 30% from its highest high. And I don't know that symbolizes the end of the supply problem with wood, but it definitely is the exact type of indicator that he was talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like anything, like there will be long lasting inflation from a pre-existing base level, right? So the fact that we're what you just said, we're 30% down from, lumber prices that were upwards of hundreds of percent, right? Higher than they were when we were buying them just 12 months ago, and 30% down from 100. Like, this is great. It's a great start. But what we're going to come back down to, it'll be interesting to see.
I think, to me, I was really concerned about runaway inflation. And if we keep pumping money into the economy, I think it is inevitable that we will have it. However, I can now see a different perspective where those high prices, all of a sudden, people start looking at alternatives. Innovators get to enter the market. People that are saying, well, maybe we don't build houses with sticks of Canadian lumber. Maybe we build them with this composite material that comes from southern Utah or something like that. So to me, having Lacey Hunt on and now watching whether his predictions come to fruition have been really interesting.
Yeah. My mind veered off when you said looking to alternatives, not just like in our market, but looking for alternatives in other markets that maybe aren't making decisions that make their market behave that way.
Like what?
But I don't know. Like, my mind is resting heavy on this idea of the failures of the nation state because of reading. It's one book right now. I would highly recommend it, The Sovereign Individual, but it talks about these things almost very highly prophetically nearly 20 years ago in terms of, what are the decision matrices of a nation state in its current form. And if we carry these patterns forward, say, any amount of time, eventually we'll reach a state that looks like X, Y, and Z. And look at the world around us right now. It looks very, very similar to the way that this text spells out X, Y, and Z. So what do people start doing when X, Y, and Z is manifesting in the market and in the place that they live? Well, they're going to look for alternatives. And then it goes to this, like El Salvador adopting Bitcoin. I'm not saying that makes this the new perfect nation state to move to, but I'm saying that people are it'll be like a market when there's a bad product that has a monopoly. Alternatives are going to find a way to sprout up, and the more that we make decisions that take us off of a market leading perspective in terms of being the highest quality place to live, it's like everything is great until it's bad all at once idea. It's like maybe people are going to be like, oh, well, where could I go that might be better than this sort of thing?
When I was in grad school and we start studying international relations and diplomacy, you first start saying, well, what is diplomacy? Well, it's sending an embassy, a group of people that represent the leader of a country to another country. Well, then you have to start saying, well, what is a country? And it turns out countries are a relatively new invention. It was really only after World War I, when you have the Treaty of Westphalia, where you start saying all right, we're going to agree. How do we know where the borders of a country are? How do we know who's in charge and who do you negotiate with? How do you decide what is a treaty and what makes a treaty actionable, right? So it's a really funny thing because we have this conception because of the way we learn about history. We hear about things like Rome, or we hear about, the Germanic people, right? But what we don't understand is that for the most part, countries as they are right now are one, completely human invention, and two, a really recent invention that does not have necessarily the stability that they will last forever, right? Because we have this conception of the way that a country will work is like, oh, okay, Germany's a country, Germany will always be a country. And you could either look at it from the perspective of like Russia invading into the Ukraine and saying, well, what was the Ukraine is now ours. Or it could be something as like way bigger where you're saying the the structure that people use to govern themselves will break up entirely, and you will have this movement towards a different way to decide who's in charge, where are the borders, whose jurisdiction are you under for law. So, if you murder somebody, is it a territorial murder? Is it that you've subscribed to some sort of citizenship? And that's an interesting concept, because until somebody points out to you that countries are a new invention, you don't know it. You just don't realize it.
Yeah, and we're going to very much go back to the old ways of, carrying forward a hypothetical scenario where a nation state countries do break down, like to your point, like in Eastern Europe, not to mention like the breakup of the Soviet Empire. We're going to go back to the old ways of deciding how we create bonds with a culture and with a people, and for drawing those borders, like what happened when the Austria-Hungarian Empire broke up. The countries kind of separated very much based off of like what languages people spoke and what cultures were prevalent. Same thing goes for the Soviet Empire of, all right, this massive communal entity breaks down. What are the countries that how are those borders drawn, right? Well, it's like, well, we've got this group of people over here and we all speak the same language. We eat the same food. We have the same values. We follow the same religions. So let's draw our borders around like roughly these lines. And maybe there's some contention there. And then that's where and the dynamics of diplomacy come into play or whatever. But it goes back to the old kind of ingrained like cultures that help divide those lines.
Well, and those lines themselves, it's a funny thing when you go understand how the British were so powerful while being just this like tiny little empire. One of the things that they did was they stopped doing the old way of deciding borders, which was natural, a river, a mountain range, something that you could look at and say, that's the clear line. But the British used to come in and say, we're going to draw a line using these parallels and these longitude and latitude lines, and we're going to draw it. And so you could be walking on a flat plain and at one point be in Kenya, and then in another moment be in Tanzania. And the division is not, do the people speak the same language or not, or are they, from different tribes? They would just split them in half. And one of the reasons that they did this was because they knew that people would fight over those things. And when they're fighting each other, they're not fighting the British. So the British were able to be like, here, we've given you your country. Oh, by the way, India and Pakistan, it turns out you guys are going to fight over where we put this Hindu Kush line. And now what you're going to have to do is fight with each other. And then we'll just come in here and be the ruling elite that do business and aren't caught up in all of these problems. And so the very thing that was used to create the current system that we're in is in fact something inherently unstable on purpose. And a lot of people don't really understand, when you think about what the borders are of a whole bunch of different places, like when you start saying like, oh yeah, the thing that we've overlaid with the map isn't real, or you can't see it unless somebody tells you it's there, then all of a sudden you start saying like, this really is a lot more human constructed than I kind of always felt.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had totally never heard that perspective before. And it points out this idea of like borders being kind of equally, like enough time has went by where with the exception of, skirmishes in different parts, like you mentioned Russia, Ukraine, like there's the Israel-Palestine conflict. Like when was the last time that there was a real conflict on the global scale over borders? You know what I mean? Where it's kind of like this concept that doesn't hold a whole lot of stock anymore, I guess. What do you
mean it doesn't hold a lot of stock? I mean, like, people all believe in borders right now. That's not gone.
Yeah, people definitely believe in borders, but when I say doesn't hold a lot of stock, I mean, if you were to, we're so globally connected now, and it's almost like you fight with your family sometimes, but you don't like kill a family member the same way that you would like, maybe in tribal times, say like kill a stranger sort of thing, or like go to war with a country that you don't know. We're also interconnected. People are traveling all the time, like diplomats going back and forth, whatever's going on there, that if you were to, lift off this border layer at any given point, it would just be interesting, right? Like what with the cultural differences and stuff blending together, what would be the repercussions of something like that? I don't know.
It's an interesting thing. Like, you think about a place like Canada, right? So the US and Canada, those two cultures they're not the same, right? But they're not that different. And I remember just the other day, I was calling this guy, Jay Curtis, up in Ontario, and he sent me his phone number, and I was like, wait, can I just dial? Am I able to just call Canada? Is that possible? And then you're like, oh, I'll just give it a shot. And sure enough, right? So now ideas can go across that border way, way faster than you could physically. And so the only difference, and now it's funny because we lived in a world where the US-Canada border was completely porous before. I mean, as long as you had the right, birth certificate or passport or whatever, even before, for a long time, you didn't even need that. And right now you can't go over into Canada, right? Like, they might as well be Russia or Yugoslavia or something like that, because you literally can't go there right now.
Yeah, fair enough, right? I mean, like, less than 2 years ago, I was driving across the, what would have been northwestern Canadian border with, like, we pulled out one passport, like 3 people in the car, there's a freaking cat in the back sort of thing, you know what I mean? It's like, here we are, we're in Canada, and I'm going to fly back, and it's going to be no problem here in a couple days. Now we are so locked down that it's like, in a lot of ways, I think the last year has thrown us forward, right, from a like competency using technology perspective and these sorts of things. But then, maybe at a higher level in these sorts of ways, it's put us back. And I think these sorts of things will come out of pretty quick. Like, how long do you think these sorts of borders will realistically stay down? I don't know. My hope would be that by the end of the year, like this time next year, we're able to equally freely transcend that border.
I think the Canadians have every incentive right now to keep that border shut, because just like in the United States, how domestic producers were able to do much better when you have all the ports clogged up and you can't send goods there, the Canadians, for a small period of time, get to allow their domestic producers to be able to produce without foreign competition, without U.S. competition. And I think that is probably more beneficial to the Canadians than it is to the U.S., although, Canada is the largest trading partner with the United States. So I'm sure it's harming both of us in our own way. But I think that this has gone way beyond the protection of COVID and is much more about, because really, if it was about COVID, right, Biden was just said that he was going to buy 500 million doses of the vaccine.
Donate them.
Then just donate them right to Canada, right? If really what we wanted to do was to solve the trade problem between us, we could do it, really, really fast. There's, barely any people over in Canada. We could solve that, but that's not actually what's happening. I think there is. People are taking advantage of that border being closed in the same way that you would love to if you were in charge of the government to do with tariffs, but that are not politically feasible. But in this particular case, you get to exert extreme tariffs on Canada.
Yeah, because you don't have the same sort of leverage with tariffs as you do right now because of circumstances. Because of circumstances, we're able to keep that border closed, impose higher tariffs, like taxes on, screening things before they come in. I have no idea of the dynamics of what's going on there, frankly. But to this concept of, it's better for, like, quote unquote, the Canadians to have this border closed so that there can be more internal integration of infrastructure on their side. Like, who's really benefiting from that? Is the average Canadian citizen or the average Canadian firm or something like this who is promoting this innovation benefiting any more than they would as if these borders were open? Or is the state, which is able to tax higher, these sorts of internal things going on, the greater beneficiary there? That would be what I think is going on.
So you brought up the fact that El Salvador has just now officially designated Bitcoin as a currency in their country, which is really interesting. And I was kind of joking in one of our private groups that when the EU first started talking about the euro, the IMF came around and was like, hey, any of you guys that are saying you won't take the euro, no way. The only way you can participate in the IMF and be a part of the World Bank is if a country designates their own currency, everybody has to accept that currency as the like really that is their currency. And I believe that that ruling is going to come back and bite the Western world, or the kind of the Western elite world, in the ass, because El Salvador choosing to denominate their currency in Bitcoin as itself, which I believe right now El Salvador uses US dollars as its current currency.
They did before.
Yeah, and so which is not uncommon. Panama does it too. The US doesn't encourage it, but it also doesn't discourage it. But the hilarious part about this is now that's going to force basically the entire world into accepting Bitcoin as a global currency. And I think that this will have different things, different impacts on, right now, Bitcoin, when you go to sell them or even use them as a form of currency, they end up being charged at the highest capital gains rate. Well, currency trading is not at the highest capital gains rate. So this is going to change the taxation in the United States by default because of what El Salvador has done.
Oh, really?
In my opinion, I mean, like I'm not a financial expert. I just play one on the podcast, but
fair enough, right? Like, but carrying forward the repercussions of like actually recognizing this for the first time as a currency for a nation, being able to carry into these sorts of gray, it'll make its way, like these sorts of cases will arise over time, like undoubtedly, right? Like it'll make its way into that muddled area of like, I bought this currency in El Salvador and it was a currency here and I'm exchanging it for this currency here. So what's the gains rate here when, I'm trading US dollar for a euro, which is like, what's $1? It's like 140 in US euro. Like I could see how if I was the investor looking for a loophole, that would be one of the places that you would look. So those cases will come forward.
El Salvador, so far, I think they are planning to ramp this up in very interesting ways, which will probably draw some of the top intellectual talent in this space towards them. So New Zealand, for example, recognized that they were way far away from the rest of the world and that people would get stressed out about what was going on in the United States or what's going on in Europe. And they would say, I want to get away from this. I'm going to go move somewhere to get out of there. Well, New Zealand said, that's fine. You have to have $10 million in the bank and you have to pay us $1 million. And then we'll let you basically buy citizenship. And then you also have to have some skills that we want here. Well, El Salvador has essentially proposed the same thing, only I believe that and I don't think this is official yet, but this is where their president said that they were headed. It's going to cost you 3 Bitcoin to get in, and then you can be an entrepreneur there. You can get the full rights of being a citizen, which means like things are going to change, right? People will move there. 3 Bitcoin, $90,000 in if you're looking at today's strike price of Bitcoin, not that much. And if you're also coming, you know how to trade in Bitcoin, maybe you can innovate in Bitcoin. Maybe they become the Switzerland of the digital economy. And it seems preposterous right now, but they're the first mover, and first mover gets huge advantages.
Yeah, I mean, this might be another example of the costs of, leaving your home nation going down at scale, right? Because this isn't an uncommon concept. It's like this has been the case in a country like Seychelles for a long time, where you can kind of buy your common place to, put your capital gains in a untaxed like nation. I'm not hyper familiar with the structure, but I know that it was similarly like, say, God forbid you're ever being pursued for whatever, like something you might have committed. I can't remember the terminology, but there was a joke around how it's called like the get out of jail free buy-in or something like that, where basically for $10 million, you could be like, oh, you can become a immediate passport holding whatever full ride citizen of, our tiny little, however big island Seychelles. You're just going to need to pay us a, $10 million fee, right? So they like know who their target customer is in that scenario. It's the same target customer who's probably keeping hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in, these rinky-dink little banks over there. It's a funny thing.
Yeah, and if you're a little country and you're trying to attract immigration, you're not trying to attract the immigration of just manual laborers. You have enough of those. What you want is people that already have a large income or at least a balance sheet, and then are able to innovate and create new structures where your intelligent citizenry but maybe you don't have the organizational skills to start a business, or you don't have the connections with people from other countries. So by doing this, I think it's a very smart move. And I think, Balaji, who's always out on Twitter talking about this, kind of digital citizenship that happens when Bitcoin comes about, he's basically been calling this for I don't know, years at this point, basically saying the countries and cities that embrace entrepreneurs in this way are going to get a first mover advantage. This is like once in a, even further than a generation innovation, and it's not going to come around again. There's not going to be Bitcoin 2.0 that is as revolutionary as the first one.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. And there's like the saying that goes around kind of in circles that follow Balaji, that if Balaji's scenarios are starting to play out, then watch out, because there's like the transitionary period from, one form of operating as a society to another. As these sorts of changes start to take place, what does it look like when the old ones break down? I don't know. I think it'll be an interesting thing.
Well, you've mentioned this concept a couple of times while we've been talking so far, is that things are slow right up until they're not, right? Like the way that society changes is it's like incremental, and then you hit a tipping point, and then it like, and I'm trying to think, it's called a trophic cascade, right? So this is when you've got an environmental stressor that's on there. Maybe mosquitoes start dying off, and suddenly there's less and less food for the bats to eat. And then that's really not that big of a deal. There's less bats, as mosquitoes go down, and then there's no mosquitoes, and now there's no bats. And then boom, that hits some massive change in the environment, and now all of a sudden there's not enough beavers, and there's no beaver dams, and water is flowing in totally different ways. And so you see the actual physical environment change, even though the one thing that was happening was that mosquito populations were going down slowly.
Yeah. And frankly, I think that this is the sort of thing that we'll start to see, whether it's over the next decade or over the next couple decades, and maybe why it's come up here a couple times, because I think that I frankly don't know how much longer a country in its current structure can last. You know what I mean? With the amount of waste that makes its way through the system, and what are I was reading on this concept the other day, and it was of the taxpayer versus the tax consumer, right? So it's like we all kind of position ourselves as taxpayers, but then while we all might be paying taxes in one form or another, maybe it's taxpayers and tax beneficiaries, but there's one portion of society that is, paying more taxes than they're benefiting from. That's not to say that they're not getting to drive on roads or take advantage of some of the other benefits that come from taking part in a society. But then there's people that are highly leveraging their ability, that they're getting different sorts of benefits that come from taking part in the system that these taxes are being paid to. So it's cycling out of one. This isn't like a novel concept. It's cycling out of a high income to, I think it was something ridiculous, like the top X% of earners paid for 30%. And I can't remember if it was like 1% or 10%. Frankly, either of those would be shocking. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say that it was the highest 10% of income earners that are paying, to 30.8% into our income taxes that are taken in by the government to redistribute. That's crazy. And that's where I'm saying, what happens when viable alternatives start to pop up, and it'll be like a market competition dynamic, except in the form of countries, you know what I mean? Where it's like, I'm not getting the ROI to the taxes that I'm paying here anymore. And I sell an information service, or I sell a technology, or whatever your deal is, it's becoming more and more feasible to be able to relocate to somewhere where it's going to be more intrinsically beneficial. And what's going to happen to the structures that take in that wealth and use it to maintain their structure, however wasteful it may be? I don't know. I could be just way off, like Peter Thiel paradox sort of thing, but I don't think so. I feel like there's a lot of different little niche groups that subscribe to this idea. That the first time I came across it was a really good book. I've tried to get him on the podcast before. Listeners know I'm filter guests through sometimes. Parag Khanna wrote a really good book called Connectography, I think in early 2000s. And even before that, the book I referenced earlier in this podcast, The Sovereign Individual, this was written in the 90s. They kind of talk about some of these sorts of ideas, but I don't know, of just like, it's going to make more and more sense for things to kind of like Brexit. We saw this happen. It's like, why are we paying taxes into the EU? And it's like, hey, if we were to keep these here and invest them in our country, it's like, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think Brexit is the perfect example for why the liberal belief of, and maybe neoliberal belief of, and I mean liberal in the sense of international relations, not as in like progressive politics like you hear here. So in international relations, there's really two giant schools of thought. There's the realists and then the liberalists, right? So the realists believe there will be nation states, or there's power amassed in groups, and that power is all that matters. And liberalists believe, look, the more trade we have, the better that we are, and that ultimately the countries end up coming together. They grow together, and they amass more by conjoining themselves. And the EU was a perfect example of the liberalist concept really coming to fruition, until all of a sudden the citizens of the UK decided, no, we don't want to be a part of that. And they had kept their currency out anyway. They didn't want to be a part of it fully with the EU, but nobody was expecting that they would rip their country out of the EU system. And that was the same time that there was Trump coming into office. The five-star party in Italy was going on. I mean, there's going to be increasing pressure. And I think the EU is probably the highest likelihood to break up as a, whatever you want to call that, conglomeration or federation of states. I think that's where we will see it happen first, before you see something happen like the United States breaking up into some sort of federalist system, because we just don't have, there's not enough differentiation between people living in the states in here, but in the countries inside of Europe, they've kept their own languages, they've kept their own traditions, and I think given the chance, there are a lot of individuals there that would say, hey, I want to break away from the EU.
Yeah, that's right, which is why it goes back to kind of the original cultural things that hold people together. And yeah, I mean, that's interesting too, with like what you described as like the neoliberal versus the rationalists. Realists, right? It's kind of similar to, I don't know what the dichotomy there would be, but like a communism / a utopian ideal versus, something else, maybe just being like, go capitalism, go for the intrinsic benefit, because going for the intrinsic benefit is going to benefit society. These sorts of ideas kind of in conflict with each other. And this isn't like a novel concept to think that like the former won't work, like the utopian communist idea. It's like,
well, I'm probably not being fair. Like the liberalist idea has plenty of backing behind it. It's not as cut and dry as like, hey, communism doesn't work because it falls apart and it actually becomes an oligarchy. And in the liberalist concept, what it's basically saying is, the way that you create more peace is that you have more trade, and the trade ends up binding people together. Whereas the realists say the way you get more peace is you have one or two major poles that exerts influence through force, a bigger military, and that's what brings peace. Because essentially the international relations theories are all about what propels forward nation states to do the things that they're doing. And the realists believe you're in constant pursuit of power, and that power in terms of military can be in terms of financial. And the liberalists believe it's constant in terms of gaining more resources. So how can you leverage the resources that you have to be able to amass more? The reason I want to clarify that is because it'd be very easy for people to default and be like, oh, I'm a realist and not one of those commie liberalists. But I think there are a lot of people that understand the value of trade really has created peace, and there's a very strong case for the liberalist idea.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? And I guess going back to this, and I'm not refreshed on like the ideas from that book, but like this connectography kind of talks about some of these sorts of ideas of like, yeah, like trade will hold us together, but it'll hold us together when we're individual too, not becoming larger conglomerated entities that, intertrade. Like, well, this is why something like an EU makes sense, because these sorts of things become easier until the entity that, all of the goop in between the cracks starts to get thicker and thicker. And what like the analogy of the goop is the entity that's taxing the ability to organize this sorts of trade to the degree where it's like, hey, if we could just leverage information and, technology and whatever to be able to come to these sorts of agreements without this entity in the middle that's taking X percentage for facilitating ?
I 100% agree with. And like, it makes less and less sense for you to amass a larger and larger governance system, right? Like the federalist system that we have in the US, which has largely been discounted by people living on the coasts who say, look, we have all the population, therefore we should just do popular vote. We should do things as one giant mass of a country. And then you have people living out in the rural areas being like, whoa, we're growing the food. We're where the resources come from. You're extracting out this value. We want to have control over our lives. Otherwise, we're just serfs to you. And I think if the coasts continue, and cities, it's not just the coast, it's also Chicago, it's probably St. Louis, it's these places where large groups of people keep trying to assert their authority over other people because they have a larger mob. I think you will start seeing more of what's going on in the state of Iowa, where they're going into Western Oregon counties and saying like, hey, you guys want to come join us in Greater Idaho? And I think you may see a breakup of things like that. Do you think the U.S. government will allow counties to leave the state that they're in and join a different state?
I have no conceptual framework for what my inclination would be no, because it seems like if I'm thinking on behalf of a complex entity that wants to maintain power and garner as many resources as it can, the ability for smaller units of my conglomerate to make agreements that benefit each other without my approval doesn't seem to be in my best interests. You know what I mean? So my inclination would be to say is that no, they would in fact be like, no, states have drawn their lines, like, I don't know, or maybe just like being that goop in the middle that facilitates, like, yeah, we can facilitate this, but it's gonna, I don't know if it's a financial cost or like a power. I don't know. My inclination would be is that they're going to, play their role and make it a pain in the ass. But yeah.
I think those graphs that show, there's this many people living in this one, county in LA. And then you show some giant mass of states, like let's just say like Montana, Wyoming, and part of Utah. And it's like there's the same number of people live in this one little county as live in this giant area. Therefore, the people in this county should have as much power over the people living with this much space. And like this is like really, really polarizing logic. Right? Like the people that are living in the cities that want to say like, look, we have the votes and we've grown up with this philosophy that one person, one vote, everybody's equal. And so therefore any of this concept of the electoral college or the fact that you produce resources and we need resources has no bearing on things. We've agreed on the rules. Eventually people will get tired of it and try and exert their own freedom. Now, I don't know what happens out of that. But my guess is it cannot go on forever that the people in the cities keep exerting their will on the people living in the countryside.
Yeah, and that's where my mind, I guess, was just going as you're saying that, right? It was that idea of the rationalist versus the neoliberal there, and then there's this fallacy of all. And like, it's not a fallacy, like all men are created equal, but as soon as you're created, as you start to navigate your way through the world, like differentiations pop up, but that's like a different thread. This idea of like the broader geographical group, like let's play through a scenario where, the 20 million people in LA have their own sovereign entity, and the 20 million people with the broader geographic group are their own sovereign entity. Then who's going to have the power, Vance? It's like, it's going to be the ones with the resources that are filtering X percentage of like their land, their limited water, like their X and Y and Z, into this really small in group. And yeah.
Well, I mean, yes and no, because the flip side of this is that county in LA also has the port that moves more freight through it than any other port in the Western Hemisphere. So you can have all of the resources you want, but the reason those resources matter is not because you're going to consume them, but because you're planning to have somebody else buy them from you so that you can buy other goods that you want. And so that tension is not, well, so this is great because there's the realist power balance, right? Of like, all right, well, you've got what we need here, and all right, well, we've got what you need here, so let's just come to an agreement here. And yeah. Yeah, but I do think that that right now most people view this through a lens that is way oversimplified. It is like one person, one vote, and we've amassed a group of people that believe the same things, they fly the same flags, and if you don't like it, doesn't matter, our mob is going to push you over. But people won't I don't want to say that. My conception is, or maybe my desire is, that people won't accept that. But coronavirus taught me that people will accept a lot more suffering and control by other people than I ever imagined. I was personally quite shocked at how willing people were to give over their freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, what is freedom but the ability to choose? And it's a scary thing to make a decision because there are repercussions to decisions. So it's, if you don't have a framework for what might be a good decision and what might be a bad decision, if you aren't comfortable with ambiguity, someone, stepping in and saying, hey, I'm presenting any decision, as opposed to ambiguity, it can be very attractive to just choose going forward with that decision as opposed to lurking in your own ambiguity or going through the effort that's required to create your own framework for making a better decision.
Yeah. And with that, I think social pressure is a far, far more powerful thing than I really ever realized. Like, I am willing to be extremely disagreeable. Like, it's not something I like to do, but like, I'm completely comfortable telling somebody or having a group of people be very, very angry with me. It's okay with me. But I don't think I would have walked into my local grocery store without a mask. And I don't think anybody would have hit me. I don't think, maybe they would have asked me to leave and I'd have been embarrassed, but I don't think I had the actual fortitude on that one. And so then that makes me wonder, like, if you can have somebody literally place a piece of cloth over your face in order to be outside and you're not willing to push back on that, then I have to ask myself, well, what would I push back on? And I don't actually know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know where that line gets drawn, right? I think there's a weird thing with this like new mob mentality that's coming up where it's almost like, I don't know, over the last X amount of time, like the return on the return on investment towards violence has been going down and down and down and down, and this trend towards the mob requesting X, the mob requesting Y. We want you to behave this way. We want you to behave that way. Seems like the ROI on violence is beginning to go back up, and I don't know.
Oh, wow. That's right. A really interesting idea. So we had Mark Reardon on last week, and he was talking about, we talked about the kids jumping on cop cars. And, it could have been any city in America. And it was one of the things that we talked about, right? This is going on. And then lo and behold, it did happen in other cities in America where young people drunk in the streets, angry about whatever, saw a cop car, got on top of it. And now you have a police officer with, let's just be really conservative. Let's say he has 30 bullets in his Glock, in his service weapon.
Well, and God forbid he used them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But there's way more than 30 people there. He's one person. Like, what force could he have used there? Not that I necessarily think he should have. I'm just saying, like,
drive over, like, I don't know, whatever the scenario is, right? But playing. It's like, it's weird because that was a manifestation of like literal physical violence in one form, right? Literally jumping on a cop car, like that was ridiculous. And this has begun to happen. Like, look at the videos in Chicago, look at Miami, people like physically attacking a police officer. It's ridiculous. But that being said, it's weird because back to that idea of like the return to violence, it's like, it's social violence. It's like what ushered out the feudal era, right? Where people used to give up their land to, people to protect them from, like, knights would just roam around and frickin' take what they needed, right? Like early agrarian society, blah, blah, blah. It was gunpowder, the ability for the people to say, like, no, we're like, come over here with your horse and your sword. I'm going to blow your head off. Right. So there's this weird, like this conglomerated into nation states protecting people, like society has come in waves, but now here we are. And like the violence that we're enacting to say, no, you can't just, shoot me, lawman. And I'm not comparing like the police to like the knights of old that used to like raid, areas or anything like this, but that's what they're viewed as by these groups. I don't know. It's weird. I don't have like I'm trying to like frame, like fractal down this, like make it more concrete, but it's the mob having an ability to get what they want through social violence, equivalently to how it used to be able to be gotten through physical violence.
Well, and you've created the world right now, or our country right now, has created a certain amount of social pressure against people using force to stop, violent acts like riots or people jumping on cop cars. I don't know how long that lasts, right? Like, I don't know how long, because eventually the people that are the faceless individuals or the people that are living out in the suburbs, eventually they just say like, look, I just don't want this problem anymore. So I'm going to authorize vastly more power to be used in those situations. And that, then you ratchet up the violence. I don't think that suddenly stops the problem. I think it just ratchets up the violence overall. But, what is the alternative? I don't see how. I have right now no picture for how the violence goes down naturally without some sort of direct, clear intervention of a group of people deciding that they are going to take charge of this situation.
Well, it's individual people like becoming better. Like, this is the thing. It's like, it's the bottom up solutions versus like the top down solutions, or like, on this earlier, but it's, what does this group want? This group or any group that ever, enacts violence, like sometimes it's goods and it's resources, but now we live in an abundant society where these people don't want resources. They want social change. They want like structural change. They want X or Y or Z. I don't know. It's weird. Individual people need to be better. That's like the pathway out. One person at a time needs to like make the decision. It's hard because that's like the slow change versus the fast change. You can't speed that process up. It has to happen over time.
So what are you working on these days to make yourself better? You're always honing something.
In terms of making Ben better, trying to, I've been like consuming a lot more than I've been outputting, I feel like, over the last, X amount of time. So I've been sitting down regularly, like I'm writing, and this is helping me. It's like it's your thing, right? You don't know what you say until you say it out loud. And, if I don't always have a setting, to speak through ideas like this, it's like, I can open up my notebook and I can write out a concept, and doing this while reading sort of different things where it's like, here's an idea here. It's amalgamating in my brain. I've built up like the dam, the water's about to overflow. Then I like put the pen down. You're just like, it's cathartic, right? It all just don't even really need to think about what you're writing sort of thing. It's like what Jung would call like automatic authoring, or like different, Stephen Pressfield has a term for it sort of thing. You just put the pen down and write. And it's like, that's a surprisingly beneficial practice that I would highly recommend to anybody who's trying to be a better individual, right? To make yourself better is you got to understand the problem, and yourself is the problem. So put the pen down and understand yourself. How do you think? What are your demons? Like, what are your desires? These sorts of things. It's been fun. I would say very much that, I guess, writing and thinking, right?
Yeah, I think the writing one is one that's like the easiest for me to give up, right? Like, I don't have time. Like, I need to empty the dishwasher instead of taking this time at 5 a.m. to write. But you don't really necessarily notice how big of a change is happening when you're writing. So you think it's not like jogging where you're like, I went jogging for 2 weeks and suddenly I'm able to jog a half a mile further or a little bit faster. With a writing, it's not quite like that, but you do start noticing there was a bunch of chaos in my life that started to just kind of sort itself off, or like some stress that I had that was really bothering me. And now the answers seem to be just a little bit clearer, a little bit earlier. And that just goes and goes and goes. But when you stop writing, it doesn't just evaporate immediately, right? So it's just like eating. It's just like exercise. It's a slow build towards it becoming valuable. And then if it goes away, it slowly erodes away. And so it's hard to remember, why am I spending the time to do this?
Yeah. It is very much that like first step, I think, of understanding yourself and like removing the chaos from like what you just said of your own life. And then what do you do when you reach that point? Like, say you don't give up writing and the chaos comes back. It's like, that's great. Then you can start the cyclical cycle and, start organizing the chaos in your life again. But then what do you do? What do you do when you get that chaos organized? You got to look for, look for other things to, like, not organize, right? But look for other places to improve, like the net good.
Well, like Jordan Peterson talks about, you got to find another room to clean up. Right?
Yeah,
like
that's right.
If you've cleaned up this room and you're like, I'm getting bored. I got that room cleaned up. Like, we'll just walk into a different room. There's mess somewhere else. So Ben, you are the executive producer of the podcast. Let's have a little conversation about some of the favorite episodes that you've heard, or some of the people that struck you as having particularly good ideas. What were some that stick out to you?
I guess most recent, top of mind, right, is Ben Lando Taylor. He was a good one. You mentioned at the beginning of that episode, I think, made the recommendation there because I'd been reading some of the things he'd been putting out. And to be totally honest, at that point, I didn't even know that he was working in tandem with Sam Oberja. It was like Ben Lando came up somewhere, like podcast feed. I don't know. But I was like, I like these ideas. I want to hear what this guy has to say. And like the most recent thing, like I publish on a weekly basis, like some of the things that you guys talked about on that episode, I thought were really interesting because, like, as we've shown through our conversation here, I like to think about kind of like what are the underlying dynamics of like some of these like macro complex problems. And that was a fun one, I guess, for that reason, right?
He talked about the concept of succession planning, and if people haven't gone and listened to this episode, it was like really impactful to me. So I sit on a board for a community bank here, and as soon as I realized, like he was saying, one of the greatest threats to the Western world is the fact that the baby boomers have not really been able to master passing down the information and how they got the institutions to work. And I don't know if his exact hypothesis is correct, but it formed in my mind a hypothesis that I have, which is after World War II, a whole bunch of people that had been living in rural communities where there was no anonymity, that you had to participate because somebody had to be on the school board, somebody had to run for mayor, somebody had to be the police chief, right? And you knew all these people. So they had learned, and over many, many years, many generations, developed a culture around participating as a member of the community, using the institutions, being a part of them, growing up in them, and then passing them down. And then as the internet came up, as people moved, in massive waves from the countryside to the city, the first generation had all those skills. So they were able to build massive companies, the Monsantos of the world that were developing technologies to stop, Parkinson's disease and to create glass that didn't cut your head off if you went through the windshield, and DuPont and all, 3M and all these companies. And then you hit a point where those great people that were moving from the rural to the city now all of a sudden are raising children that have only ever lived in the institutionless cities. And so they grow up and they don't learn those, but maybe they watch their parents, be a part of it. But then you have another generation. So it's almost like everyone that moved into the city were immigrants, as though the immigrant populations right now in the U.S. are the hardworking ones that bring a cultural tradition, and then their children, and especially their children's children, don't have any of the old world ways to pass on that institution like knowledge. And how do you do the pass down, and how do you participate in meetings, and how do you solve problems, and how do you get people to agree that don't want to agree? And so now you have this major, major problem of succession planning. And after we listened to that podcast, I sent out a survey. Well, you know this, that we sent out a survey to people that I'd gone and given speeches to in the past and said, hey, out of all the things I've been working on over the last year, what would you like me to come talk about? And one of them that I wrote in there, I just kind of threw in there, like how to improve your ability to pass on institutional knowledge, succession planning. Well, that one went through the roof, the number of groups that said, I think it was the most answered question. That's what they want because it's the problem that everyone is facing right now. And so I think Ben Lando Taylor really hit on something important, and it may be why the nation state itself is crumbling, because we don't have that institutional knowledge on how to do succession planning.
Yeah, maybe, right? Like you've got one group of people that are holding on to the power that they have for dear life and continuing to create processes that amalgamate more resources to, keep that structure in place. And is there, like, I don't know the answer to that. Is there a competent group to come next?
I think it'll have to be a culture that has been outside of the mainstream, that will have developed and created things that matter, that will then come and take over, just like everything else, right? Eventually the third generation or so loses the ability to hold on to it, and a new group of invaders comes in and takes over.
Yeah, right. There was like sometimes I'll hear what you're talking about here, right? And my mind will like just shoot off in a different direction, but it shot towards the variance is a benefit. And this is like I give credit to this to Kate, right? Like you mentioned Kate, probably
Kate Crosby.
Kate
Yep.
Crosby. Yeah. She's talking about this idea in like evolutionary biology, how if there is more, if there's more variance amongst a species, it has a greater evolutionary advantage, whether it's in a geography or whatever, right? Because when there are systems in place that cause conflict, whether it's like call it a plague or call it an X or Y or Z or a drought, anything, right? Any environmental systems that would, otherwise be a harm to the species. High variance amongst that species is going to be a good thing because there's going to be different strains that weather these different challenges, and they can come back together because it's all the same species at the end of the day with different variances. And it's just it was an interesting concept, and thinking there as you were saying this regarding succession planning, maybe this is part of the issue is there's not a whole lot of variance. We're facing a lot of challenges, but we're not varying our strategies for weathering those challenges. It's like we're always printing money. We're always doing X. It's like
we keep coming back to the same solutions that we had.
Exactly.
And so one of the things that I've talked with Kate about this, I've talked with Rob Long about this, like people don't realize that vegetables or the things that we eat or the animals, they come from essentially a lot of the same regions, right? So like the Andes Mountains is where all of our potatoes come from. And they believe that this occurs because you have this, let's just say a tuber, and it is way up in the air, so it's closer to the sun, it's near the equator, and way more solar radiation hits this thing all the time. And so it's going to have way more mutations, just like we have mutations in our skin if we get all kinds of sunburn. And so there's a reason why, if the closer you get to the mountains where potatoes came from in Peru, that all of a sudden you see so much more variation, and it's this mutation that occurs in this space. And then the further that you get away from it, the less variation you have, which is why when they were planting potatoes in Ireland, they really only had like one or two potatoes, because those were the only varieties that they could get to grow that far away from the equator in those soil conditions. And so then when they hit a blight, boom, you have the potato famine, game over for millions and millions of people. And that's a really interesting comparison to make with, well, is that what's going on with people? If they all go to the same education types, if they all are raised under the same media diet, if they all have the same education system that whether it's in grade school or all the way up to the university, then you start producing a really homogeneous way of dealing with problems, and then you get into the danger zone.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Other people that have been interesting podcast guests lately?
I mean, Lacey Hunt definitely is top of mind, right? Like I said, I'm paying attention to like the economy, and it's interesting, like pattern spot what's going on there, like what things did he say, and not just Lacey, right? But like I'm trying to think of like our other any other.
Well, where did Lacey get it right, or where did he say something that surprised you?
The deflationary expectations, frankly, like we're still, I guess like the magnitude was like a question in my head there of like, what are the magnitude of like the comeback that we're going to see there? Because I think like it's, I could follow the logic there, and it's like, honestly, you could go back and listen to it again. Right. But, I follow the logic of like, okay, where the deflationary expectations are going to come back and swing us back down. But, in terms of, like, I like to zoom out and like, what's the long-term trend? Like, there's still going to be long-term inflationary repercussions of what we're doing, adding more money into our money circulation. So I guess that was surprising in terms of the magnitude, but it's like a good voice of reason, right? To be like, okay, it's not going to go wildly off the charts. We're not going to see 500% inflation just because we added, whatever it was, 40 something percent extra currency to the economy. It'll level back down. So, that was surprising in one sense. I'm trying to think.
Well, his perspective that really blew my hair back was this concept of, yes, we have supply chain problems. Yes, we have employment problems. But as we open up our ports, as the supply chain gets straightened out, you're going to watch prices plummet. And then that's going to cause all these other issues, like suddenly the domestic producers that could pay their employees a whole bunch of money because they had no competition and they were able to demand high prices, just like in the timber industry, right? Those mills, I'm sure, are paying people more than they've ever paid them before. They're getting bonuses that are big. Well, now all of a sudden, you're not going to have that competitive financial advantage. You're going to have low-cost suppliers. So now you're going to have to cut jobs. You're going to have to cut wages. You're going to have to, it seemed before I spoke with him as though there was no way out other than hyperinflation. I had trouble imagining a way out. And now all of a sudden I do have this concept of like, this disinflation might actually be a real thing. And then you watch the way he describes, hey, look, you keep injecting money into the system, it stops going as far each time you do it. And you're like, yeah, that's exactly right. That's 100% exactly what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a good one. I can't think of any other surprising things from that one top of mind. And then I always love like just the good conversations, like I think you and Rob really hit on that in the last one. John Jennings was a good one. Like I couldn't literally recall specific ideas from there. Like you guys talked about kind of like the organization, Dunbar number, some of these sorts of ideas, like, just a good conversation, you know what I mean? Like a good, different, like sort of like topic to carry forward for a couple minutes through. I like these.
Yeah. John Jennings is one of those, great finds that was like, he'll be on many times in the future. And I think a lot of what I like about him is the variation, right? Like we talk to a lot of people that, they're already kind of in our genre, but this guy is reading prolifically, but reading very different things than I'm reading. And I think that just makes for a really good conversation. And he's just so easy to talk to. He's just a great guy.
Yeah. The thing that I really love to see afterwards is when past guests start to interact, and you're very proactive about this sort of thing. You know the power of creating connections. Like yesterday I was working in my house and I listened to Jim Rutt and Kenneth Stanley.
Oh yeah.
That was absolutely a great interview.
Absolutely.
I would recommend, it's not plugging our own podcast, right? But a good one to check out for two past guests, Jim Rutt, Kenneth Stanley, talking about, the myths of pursuing objectives and these sorts of things. That was a good one.
I really enjoyed that one because, on my podcast, I want to know who Ken Stanley is, right? It's really interesting to me to figure out like what's going on. Do you have kids and how does this impact how you think about curiosity and novelty search? But with Jim and Ken, they were able to just sit there and talk about the subject that Ken is deeply enmeshed in, this kind of novelty search idea. And it's just a totally different podcast. And so it was interesting to hear, like, this is the conversation I've had with Jim. This is the conversation I've had with Ken. And now to see those two talk together it was awesome. And I'm really proud. Like I've actually connected Jim Rutt with several people.
Well, Matt Ridley, after listening to Matt Ridley and Jim Rutt's episode, I went back and I listened to our episode with Matt Ridley. And because it was like I'd listened to, and we'd had him on twice, right? But it was like the first time was listen to the one where he's there and he had the blanket behind him, you know what I mean? Was that the first one or the second one?
Yeah, that was the first one.
Yeah, that was the first one. That was a really good interview, like right when coronavirus started, because, Matt has been very, very vocal over the last couple weeks here with the new swing back of this idea of the lab leak hypothesis. Like I just saw like yesterday or the day before, he's co-authoring like a book kind of chronicling like the investigative process of like, okay, what's the probability of this? And he was very, open to the idea of like, hey, I wasn't like hard pushing this before, but I kept it open as a possibility. You guys even got on that conversation. Yeah, that one was way long ago, not recent, but still worth going back to. Like you guys, like the global greening concept, that was something you brought up with Todd Keskey too. That was another recent, like, was that the first in person, or he was right after John, right?
He was right after John, yeah.
Yeah, so that was starting to get back into these in-person interviews, but yeah.
And then before we close out, talk a little bit about what's going on with Wand. So for people that don't know, Ben, in addition to being an executive producer, we do a bunch of work with we kind of have a boutique PR and marketing firm. We kind of only take on the clients we really like, but we do some interesting work. We can talk about that, I guess, a little bit later. But the Wand is your primary source, right? So Ben runs an app where it's a little bit like Uber for housekeeping, and people can sign up both to have their house cleaned, or you have housekeepers that sign up because they say, "Hey, I'm willing to clean people's houses," and so you match those two together. What's it like in this post-COVID world?
I've really got no complaints with Wand, right? You know, our bigger challenge, I've been saying, has been finding cleaning providers. And I think this is like a broader issue people are having. It's like, there's finding people to do the work right now. Like the world is reopening. We had launched maybe 5 or 6 months before our first podcast, like a year plus ago. And here we had good revenue and we're reinvesting this in the company. And, you overspend to acquire customers and that money gets made back over time. And then this brick wall came down. And that brick wall was coronavirus. So we very much spent a lot of energy over the last year building back up to that point where, okay, now we're generating better revenue than we ever have before, and that's all being reinvested in the company. I've still never taken a dime out of this asset, which is very much what I view it as at this point. It's I'm not allocating the 8 to 12 hours a day I used to. I've been loving being able to watch it grow and work as its own organism, and feed it the things where it needs it. So it's been really fun, and the thing it needs right now is cleaning providers. So that's what we're working on. And then we've kind of sprung up some of these other platforms centered around the same infrastructure, where it's like, okay, here we're amidst coronavirus, and lo and behold, people aren't booking strangers to come into their home, at least to clean it for the time being, and until we worked around and got through that. But then I had different people coming to me, and they were like, "Oh, hey, I need." My business literally had to shut down. We did this once for a hair salon, right? And it was, we literally can't do business in our usual place of business. So we've got to, but we're allowed to go do it in people's houses. We need what you've got, but for our infrastructure. So we did this for, hair care. We've done this now for IT. Just wrapped up a platform. I would shout out Talent Boulevard for, connecting hiring managers and, on-air news talent. It's been fun. And I guess that veers off from Wand, but I'm really, really proud of what's been done there, and just kind of still incubating it like it's a child. And instead of kind of going this route of, I need it to be the next Uber, the next Airbnb, I've found the alternative path of, I never took on any outside venture capital that I had to adhere to be okay, I've got to get this, 10x ROI for my investors in X amount of time. That's not to say that I'm running it as a lifestyle business. I still have plans for growth. We're getting up and going in Seattle, and that's been really exciting. But yeah, just kind of this path of okay, it's growing. Bootstrapping would be the right term, right? Bootstrapping the business, all the money that gets made goes right back into it, and it's kind of snowballing from there. So it's been fun.
Well, man, it has been a blast to be working with you. I'm excited about some of the upcoming podcasts we have. We're going to be talking with Sam Oberja
next week. Yeah,
next week. That'll be a really good one, and it's just been great. But one of the things that you've done that I would love to give you a chance to shout out how people could sign up for is you've become a regular writer. So you're putting information out. Where can people find your writing that you put out? How often do you do it? That sort of thing.
Yeah, so every Saturday, I kind of take ideas, whether it's things talked about in the podcast. I'll read any scientific papers or really good articles I get my eyes on. I'll be like, oh, let's take some of the ideas, throw some of my own spins on them. But so I've got a weekly newsletter that goes out every Saturday at 7 a.m. I'm usually scheduled out weeks ahead, so expect them to come until I get busy. But I plan to do it for the time being. It's at thebenjamin.substack.com, or you can go to my website. It's just it's a little weird. It's thebenjam.in. I got a dot, I think it's .india or something like that. So it's thebenjam.in at the bottom.
We'll put a link in the show notes. Nobody understand that. This insane maniac.
Easier to do.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'll have you on as always whenever.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks for checking out this podcast. I'm so glad that you were able to join Ben and I for this interview. As I said at the beginning of the interview, if you are the type of person that has listened all the way to the end of this conversation, then you are the type of person that would love the Articulate Ventures Network. This is a sort of digital neighborhood that we have where people can join it, find other people that listen to the podcast, and have conversations about things going on in the world. One of the things that people really love about the network is that people put up ideas that other people don't agree with, but it doesn't devolve into some meaningless fight. Instead, it creates a dialogue and a conversation where people can learn and discuss and hear from people that think completely differently than you do. And I can tell you that it has pushed my thinking in all sorts of directions that I never would have had if I was only able to ever talk with the people that I see in person every day. So we would love to have you join this digital network. And if you would like to learn more, know that I am talking directly to you. And you can find out more at network.articulate.ventures. And also, if you're interested in one of those legacy interviews that I talked about at the beginning of the podcast, where I will interview one of your loved ones, you can find out more at store.articulate.ventures. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be back next week.